Hi, my name's Rex Weyler. I came to Vancouver, British Columbia in 1972. I was a draft resistor, one of 150,000 draft resistors that came from the United States. It's the largest political exodus in the history of the United States. Many people fled to Canada, and we've made our lives here. But when I first came, to me it was a world that I'd never seen before. I didn't know anybody here. I didn't know the city. I felt like a stranger in a strange land. But I became very interested in the environments, and because I was seeing it all fresh and new, I began to get this sense of the environments that people created, and I found myself wanting to capture and take pictures of people in these created environments, and how did they get there, and what were they doing, and in the process I met this community in south of Vancouver in Steveston, BC. These are Japanese people who during the war, during World War II, these people they lost their boats, they lost their homes, they were essentially arrested and put in internment camps for the entire war. And I remember hearing stories about this from my mother, whose high school friends were actually in the United States taken to internment camps during the war. These people had their homes and boats taken away, they lost everything, they were held in prison essentially and sent back to Japan after the war. They came back and they reestablished this village in British Columbia, and I was very inspired by this, about how they came back and recreated their environment. In the meantime, I got a job as a photographer and a journalist at the North Shore News in North Vancouver, and I wandered around looking for news stories and photographs. But I became mostly interested in the people themselves, and people in their environments, and the social influences on people, and how they became who they are. And I began to see and sense that people created their environments, but they were also created by their environments. They were influenced by their environments. And I began to sense also that even in ordinary situations, something extraordinary was happening. And for example, I began to sense that people were often dominated by industrialized environments in which we work all day, every day, but our psychology is shaped somewhat by these environments that we live in, and particularly by this sort of industrial environment that is sort of laid over our more sensitive, aware natures. Now, eventually, I came to Vancouver, often from North Vancouver, and wandered around the city, and I found this school in Vancouver, in East Vancouver. This is Strathcona School, very diverse students, and I became sort of captivated by these students in this environment. I asked the administration if I could stick around, and they allowed me to come back. I came back every 3 days for almost 3 months, 3 days a week for 3 months, and took photographs of these children, and they began to really show themselves to me and show me how they identified themselves and how they created their own self-image and who they were inside and how they reflected the environment outside. Now, I stayed there, the longer I stayed there, eventually the kids just ignored me, and I began to be able to wander around the school and not have kids looking at me or flocking to me, and I began to actually see and watch them create their world inside this imposed environment. And to me, it was a beautiful picture of how young children create the world that they live in. In the meantime, the rest of us, adults and everyone else, are also living in these created environments. And I began to ask questions myself, like, who creates these environments, and why, and how, and what sort of decisions are people making when they create public environments? And I began to ask the question, are we building environments for people, or are we forcing people into these environments, in sense imposing environmental restrictions on people by the sort of spaces that we create for them? Are we separating people with our environmental creations? In the meantime, I was very interested in the peace movement. I was interested in the environmental movement, and I met a group of people in Vancouver, just street people. In Vancouver, we used to meet in coffee shops and pubs. And this is a picture of us occupying a submarine base in Washington State. And this group became very active in environmental and peace work and became the Greenpeace Foundation. In 1975, we got on a fish boat and we went out into the Pacific Ocean to look for the whaling fleet. Some people told us we were crazy, that we would never find them. We were just a bunch of ragtag street kids from Vancouver, and how were we ever going to find the Russian whalers? Well, the amazing thing is we did find them. And we had a few tricks up our sleeve, but we also had some luck. But we found the whalers, and when we found them, the images that I saw, to me, were they were images of the complete plunder, the complete exploitation of nature by humanity. And it wasn't just about survival, it was about growth and domination of nature and wealth and creating and so forth. And as we approached these ships, I realized these are floating factory ships. They're catching and processing whales in the ocean. They're essentially strip mining the ocean of every living thing. Now, eventually, we felt that we could change this. That if we took photographs and we brought these photographs back, that people would see that this wasn't giant Leviathan, brave little men in little boats and giant whales. It was the opposite. It was an industrial machine that was chasing down and harpooning and killing the whales. And we figured our cameras were mightier than the harpoon, that we could actually change history by taking pictures. This is my friend Fred Easton, who was a fabulous filmmaker, and there he is with his little Bolex. Now remember, in these days there was no internet connection, there were no satellite link up, it was all film and cameras. At the same time, I also identified with the whalers themselves, because they were also victims of this industrialization of the planet. And I began to sense again that we can't really never always distinguish the perpetrator from the victims. And in fact, in this case, the whalers themselves were victims. Anyway, Greenpeace launched its boat. We came back. We did manage to bring the pictures back. We did manage to help create an environmental movement in the world, and I feel great about that. I'm glad about that. But here we are 30 years later. We still have all of these issues to resolve. We still have environmental issues to resolve. I don't think ecology was quite as obvious as we thought it might be as slavery or civil rights or women's rights. But eventually an environmental consciousness has taken hold of the world, which I feel is fantastic. At the same time, there's a lot of work to do. But remember, this was started by a small group of people. Greenpeace was started by a small group of people in Vancouver in the 1970s, street kids meeting in cafes and pubs. Anybody can start a social movement. And all you really have to do is act on your knowledge, act on your feelings. Thank you very much. My name is Rex Weyler.